nature, founded on the study of the laws of nature, those civil and religious systems which still govern the universe. When Ruins of Empire was published in this country, that section was taken out. Several years thereafter, Volney came to the country, and when he discovered that section had been taken out of his book, he refused to have it published in this country until that section was restored. Another place he said, "This race of blacks is the very one to which we owe our arts, our sciences, and even the use of the spoken word." That's why there's conflict over Africa. In a book called In the Dawn of Civilization by Gaston Maspero, he says, by the almost unanimous testimony of ancient historians, they belong to an African race which first settled in Ethiopia on the Middle Nile, talking about the Egyptians. Following the course of the river, they gradually reached the sea. Moreover, the Bible states that Mizraim, son of Ham, brother of Cush, the Ethiopian of Canaan, came from Mesopotamia to settle with his children on the banks of the Nile. J. Rogers says, the African continent is no recent discovery. It is not a new world like America or Australia. While yet Europe was the home to wandering barbarians, one of the most wonderful civilizations on record has begun to work out its destiny on the banks of the Nile. Professor Charles Signobos, who wrote a book called The History of Ancient Civilization, says, the first civilized inhabitants of the Nile and Tigris River were the dark-skinned people with short hair and prominent lips. The History of Civilization, written by a number of professors, which is now current in this country, says, by Western experience we mean the history of European civilization and its remoter origins in the earlier civilizations located in Mesopotamia and around the Mediterranean. Man began to abandon nomadic existence and live in settled agricultural communities only about 10,000 years ago. Some 5,000 years later, settlements grew up along the banks of the Tigris, Euphrates, Nile, and Indus rivers. For well over 1,000 years after their first flourishings, the people of the Valley of Civilizations held the stage virtually alone. No Europe. About 3000 BCE, at approximately the time that the Sumerian civilization emerged in Mesopotamia, the Egyptians had reached a comparable state of development. Much better known to us than Mesopotamia, Egypt was another ancient valley civilization that made major contributions to our own. I'll read what Dr. Clark said, and I think by that time I would have probably answered the question as to why there's a conflict over African history. People on one side who had ulterior motives defaming Africa, and those persons, actually scholars who've gone to Africa, who studied Africa, who know the position of Africa. Dr. John Clark says, civilization did not start in European countries, and the rest of the world did not wait in darkness for Europe to bring the light. In order to understand how the attitude came about, we need to look at the sad state of what is called world history. There is not a single book in existence with the title incorporating the words world history that is an honest commentary on the history of the world and its people. Most of the history books in the last 500 years have been written to glorify Europeans at the expense of other people. The history of Asia has been as shamefully distorted as the history of Africa. It's not possible for the world to have waited in darkness for the Europeans to bring the light, because for most of the early history of man, the Europeans themselves were in darkness. When the light of culture came for the first time to the people who would later call themselves Europeans, it came from Africa and from Middle Eastern Asia. And finally, it is too often forgotten that when Europeans emerged and began to extend themselves into the broader world of Africa and Asia during the 15th and 16th centuries, they went on to colonize most of mankind. Later they would colonize world scholarship, mainly the writing of history. History was then written or rewritten to show or imply the Europeans were the only creators that could be called, of what could be called a civilization. In order to accomplish this, the Europeans had to forget or pretend to forget all they had previously known about Africa. So the question, why African history? Because Africa is here. It's one of the 6 major land masses on the planet. And just as we should know something about Asia and North America and South America and Antarctica, we should know something about Africa. Why conflict over African history? Because of ethnocentrism, extreme ethnocentrism, because of slavery, because of ignorance, and because of racism. And now the third question Dr. Clark and Dr. Ben-Jochannan posed: what is the relationship of African history to world history? And to begin to explore that question, I got a film for you. The film is called From Ape to Man, and it will take approximately the next 90 minutes. Brother Kabas here